Welcome back to Just Make Stuff. Today we're going to talk about how to read a jumper in order to write your own pattern. The jumper that I am going to be reading today and writing a pattern for is actually a jumper that I made a couple of years ago. But you can do the same process with pretty much anything. So like fast fashion jumpers or something that you've had for a long time, something that grandma made for you. You can read the stitches that are in the jumper and create a pattern for yourself to then be able to recreate the item. And the reason that I need to do this for a jumper that I already made myself is that I did not use the pattern when I was creating this, and I very much did not take notes or make any record of what I was doing. But when I made this jumper and started wearing it around, I have had more compliments on this one jumper than on anything else that I have made. So I definitely like wearing it. I like the fact that other people like it and they think that it's from a shop or whatever. But I would like to be able to make another one. This light blue is not my favorite color. In fact, the only reason that I made it in this light blue is because someone else gave us the yarn because they'd ordered the yarn online without seeing it in person, and the color was not what they expected, so they were just offloading it. We were happy to take it, and I turned it into this jumper. I thought I would also just show you quickly what it looks like. So this is fitted around the body, but then the sleeves are really baggy and lovely cabled thing with a raglan construction. And I love this jumper. I love the way it looks. I love the way it feels, but there are a couple of things I would like to change about it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to copy the pattern as I made it in the first place. And then once I have that information, I'm going to make the edits that I need to in order to actually recreate this jumper in a way that's going to be better for the long run. The very first thing that is going to be important anytime that you're trying to read a jumper in order to make it yourself is figuring out the gauge and what kind of yarn has been used to create it. So if you want to do a fiber content test on the jumper that's already made, actually the thing that I would recommend doing is harvesting some of the fluff from it. So you don't need to cut off any part of the jumper. You can just take a minute with a razor and shave your jumper, and you'll end up with a little hairball. And you can use that for a burn test. So it's important to know what fiber your jumper started with, but there are also workarounds. So if you're not fussed about doing a fiber test, just do a little bit of looking into what concessions you might need to make in order to make it in that fiber content, and you should be fine. Once you have your fiber content figured out, the next thing that's going to be important is figuring out what weight of yarn to use and what kind of gauge you're going to be looking for. So I can take a gauge on that. I can take a gauge on this stockinette section, and I could also take a gauge on this cabled sleeve section. This gauge swatching is going to be probably the most important thing that you do, because everything else you can kind of fudge. You don't have to know exactly the shaping of the raglan increases. You don't need to count those, but it's going to make a big difference in the look of the final garment if you use a much finer yarn or a much thicker yarn than what was used in the original. It will affect the drape of the garment massively. Now, I happen to know exactly how I made this in terms of I know exactly which yarn it is, exactly what yarn weight, and exactly what needle size I used throughout. and that's because I made it myself. However, if you had not made it yourself, you would just want to measure about 4 inches, or if you have a little gauge measuring thing, I don't have one, but you can just count your row gauge across 2 to 4 inches, count your stitch gauge across the same, and note that down. You're going to need to know that gauge in order to test out yarn weights so that you can reproduce the garment as accurately, as closely as possible. So measure the gauge on the garment and then take the yarn that you think is the closest fit for it and make a gauge swatch using that yarn. And then you can do a comparison and you can see if you have picked the right kind of yarn weight for it. So I definitely recommend that you don't buy a whole jumper's worth of yarn ahead of time for reproducing this kind of garment unless you know for sure that you really want to use that, because you could say, oh, I think this is a DK weight, but when you do your gauge swatching, you may find, oh, actually it's heavier, or actually it's lighter and I needed a sport weight, or I needed some kind of a bulky yarn and I didn't realize it. That can really mess up your plans. So it's better if you're trying to reproduce something. Definitely the gauge swatches matter. And I say that as somebody who is not that into gauge swatching. Now, the most important part of this process is going to be to take notes, because that is the entire point of the process. So do write down the name of all of the yarns that you gauge swatch, the needle size that you swatched at, and the gauge that you got out of it. Write that down in a notebook or on your phone or in some kind of file where you can keep all of this information together, because it would be incredibly frustrating if you made 5 or 6 gauge swatches and by the time you finished the last one, you don't remember the exact details of the gauge swatches that you made before. So it's better to just write that all down as you go so that you have the information there ready for you to use in future. I have moved you across so you can get a better sense of what I'm doing and see exactly what I'm doing on the page and with my jumper as I reproduce this pattern. So the first thing I am going to do is to write down basic details of what this project is. The very first thing I always write down is a little description of the project that I'm working on. It can be very easy to end up with a lot of the same kind of titles of jumpers if you have a knitting journal like I do. So I like to always write down a brief description of what the pattern looks like when completed. So I try to get all of the relevant, important details. So for this one, I have written Raglin construction jumper with large cable sleeves. Raglin construction jumper with large cable sleeves and ribbing detail. The next thing that I would write down if I were doing gauge swatches would be all of my swatch details. I already know what needle size and yarn I used, including the yarn weight for this, so I don't need to do swatches. However, if you are going to be reproducing anything else, that is going to be your next big step. And when you have decided on what yarn you're going to use, that would be the next thing I would write down. Rios, Malabrigo is the brand, Rios is the weight, and the needle size will be 5mm. At this point, the thing that I'm going to do is to actually split my page in half. So on this left-hand side, I'm going to write down what the original jumper pattern is like. And on this side, that is where I will take notes of the changes that I want to make. And then once I have all of that put together, I will be able to write out exactly what it is that I want to do on another page so that I have a complete pattern for this. So first of all, let's look at the construction. This jumper was made from the top down, and it doesn't matter hugely whether you make something from the top down or the bottom up, because they are pretty much just reversible options. I could write this pattern as a bottom up pattern and it would not affect very much at all, except that it's slightly more, you need to be a little more predictable when you're writing from the bottom up. If you're looking for an easier pattern, those are always going to be written from the top down. You can tell that this was knitted in the round based on the fact that there is no seaming anywhere on the body. We've got no seaming at the underarm where you would normally expect to in a shop bought jumper. No seams on the underarm of the sleeve. You can tell just by feeling the fabric. If it feels exactly the same all the way around, it does not have any seams. And we can also tell that there are no seams on this raglan because, again, you turn it inside out and there's no extra bulk there where there would be if there had been a seam here. This is an example of a seamed jumper, and obviously you can see the seams on this quite clearly, but they're not always going to look that clear. But if you turn to the other side of the work, you can see that seam really clearly. So you know that is what a seam looks like. That could be on the underarms and the side of the body, but it can also be around the neck. The only other place I need to look for a seam is here at the neckline. And you can tell what kind of neck has been done based on how much bulk there is in this section where the body of the jumper meets the neck. Here is an example of a collar that was worked by picking up from the side, and you can see that clear line where the stitches were picked up to then work the neckline. So in comparison, it's very clear this is a neckline that was picked up from the body as opposed to this as a seamlessly worked collar. So this particular jumper, I can tell based on the fact that all of this fabric feels the same weight with no seams in. This was done entirely seamlessly. And I'm going to make the assumption that this was started from the neck just based on how easy it would be to do this completely seamlessly from the neck down. Now that I know that this is done with this as the original cast on edge and then knit completely seamlessly, I can simply count the stitches in that neckband to find out how many were cast on originally. And then from there, it's very easy to work out all of the rest of this. Now on a raglan, you can just pick one of the raglan seams and start from there and just count all the way around. And again, very simple to do. I'm going to put my thumb here. This is the raglan increase. I'm going to just mark that there at the base of this neck. I can see that there are no increases anywhere on the collar itself, so it won't make any difference if I count at the top here or at the bottom here. Anywhere on that column is going to give me the same number of stitches. So I'm going to be counting by twos because this is a 1x1 rib. So this here is a knit stitch, this is a purl stitch. So we can count purl knit, purl knit, purl knit, purl knit. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 79, 81, 83. So this was cast on with 83 stitches. I'm going to write down cast on 83 stitches, and then we're going to count how many rows of ribbing were done. Looks like either 10 or 11 rows of ribbing. We're going to say 10 because that's a little easier than using an odd number. You can alternately say, oh, this is an inch deep. In fact, I will probably write both of those down. So work in 1 by 1 rib for 10 rows, brackets, 1 inch. That's our first piece of detail there. The next thing I need to check for is neck shaping, short row shaping. So in order to do that, I am just going to match up these raglan seams. And you want to make sure that you've got them as close as possible and give it a good shake. And what you're looking for is whether the neck is the same in the front and the back. Now, this is not exactly the same. It's very slightly different. That is probably just a difference due to age and wear. Jumpers relax with wear. They do stretch out in places. That's not a big enough difference to make me think that this particular jumper has any short rows. Here I have an example of what short row shaping is going to look like. I'll move this out of the way. So this is laying completely flat, and you can see that the neckline for the back is much higher than it is for the front. It's not always going to be quite that obvious of a difference. And if you do find that it's a very small difference between the height of the front neckline and the height of the back neckline, you should also check the back for short row shaping. Anywhere where you put a short row turn in knitted fabric, it's going to feel ever so slightly different. It's going to feel like a little bit of an irregularity in the fabric. And short rows are one of the most difficult things to see when you're looking for them, but you can feel for them. So I can feel, and in fact I can see, let me see if I can get it to focus, just there between my fingers, there's a little bit of an irregularity just there. And that is where there was a short row turn. So they are at regular intervals across the back of this. There's another one there, which I can feel more than I can see. And there's another one there. For this jumper though, we have determined that there are no short rows. That is something I know I'm going to want to change, but I'm going to have to take some time to figure out how I want to change that. So in my pattern, I'm going to write here, short row shaping, please add. And that's just a note to myself for future that I do want there to be some short row shaping. So now that we have determined about the short rows, we can look at how the stitches were divided for the raglan shaping. We have 83 stitches to start with, and I am just going to divide this into 4 sections. I'm going to make a little diagram. I always find raglans easiest to understand when I make a diagram. So I just make an oval that's roughly the shape of the neck, and I add notches, and then I'm going to count how many stitches get put into the sleeve, how many get put into the front, how many get put into the back. It could be that your front and back have different stitch counts. So you just want to count everything and make sure that you have the right number in each section. So I've had a quick count, and I don't have the same number of stitches at the front and the back. There are 31 stitches at the front and 34 stitches at the back. The sleeves have the same number of stitches at the neck hole. They both start with 6 stitches between those raglan increases. The next thing I want to have a look at is how the raglan increases were done. This looks like it was a typical every other row increase at the raglans. And you can tell that just by how widely spaced these increases are. So I can tell that these are the increase stitches here, and I can tell that they are evenly spaced, just the fact that they do not change in regularity across the whole of this raglan. Now let's talk about this raglan increase a little bit more, because many patterns have a kind of a panel that goes up here that is straight stockinette, and the increases happen either side of that. And you can always tell that that's the case because it will look like there are 2 or more stockinette stitches, 2 or more knit stitches kind of stacked on top of each other going up this. And you can always tell when people have left stitches in this raglan section based on how many plain knit stitches look to be next to each other. This particular one, it just looks like there is a row of knit stitches that goes up here, or column rather. But what that means is actually that there was not one stitch set aside as the raglan stitch. It means that on the cable, there was simply a marker, and the original knitter simply knitted up to the marker, and when they got to the marker, they did an increased stitch. And then on the other side of the marker, they worked an increased stitch and then moved on. That is what gives this look. So the increases were simply done on either side of the marker without any stitches in between the increases. So I'm going to make a note of how the raglan increases are done. Because I'm trying to write down what the pattern would be, first I'm going to say divide stitches as above for raglan increases, placing stitch markers at each raglan. And then I'm going to write something about how the raglan increases were worked. So raglan increases were worked every other row on the stitch before the marker and the stitch after. And in brackets, I'm going to put that means that every increase row increases by 8 stitches. At this point, I want to have a look at the cable pattern on the sleeves. This cable pattern gets established from the very beginning of this process. So we can count how many stitches are in the cable. 7, 8. And then they have a crossing point where 4 of those get passed in front of the other 4. So these are 8 stitch width cables, and if we look on the opposite side, we can see how many purl stitches are in between, and it is 2. So this would be, for the non-cable rows, it would be 8 knit, 2 purl, 8 knit in the pattern. So let's write this down. Cable sleeve pattern. And the easiest thing to do here is actually just to draw the chart, or alternately to produce the chart on a bit of software and then inserting that into your file, or printing it and sticking it in your knitting journal. So looking at this, we can see that it has these 8 stitch wide cables, and they have a repeat of 20 rows by the look of it. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. Yeah, so this gets a cable every 20 rows. However, they are offset. So this central cable does not get cabled at the same time as the ones either side of it. So looking at this, we can see that this cable happens in the middle of this cable. This cable happens in the middle of this one. So the actual crossing over point is halfway down. What that means is every 10 rows, half of these are going to get the cable twist in them, and then the next 10 rows, it will be the other cables that get the cable twist. The easiest thing to do for that is to make a chart, and that is what I would put in here. I'm not going to do that just now because I would like to have a look at the rest of the pattern before I draw that out. But we are going to need to move to the next page because drawing in or printing and putting in my cable chart will take up the rest of that column. So we just moved to the other side. I'll just draw the line about halfway down this time. And again, original jumper on the left and pattern changes on the right. We're continuing to look at the raglan here. The thing that I see immediately is an error, and I knew that I made this error when I made this jumper. It became obvious really quickly, and I can't for the life of me think why I didn't unravel and fix this. But I continued the raglan increase too far, and I ended up needing to narrow it back in at the underarm, which left this really weird shape at the underarm. It's very, very common when you are looking at other things that people have hand knitted to find errors that they made. It's just quite a normal part of the human experience, and I think it's quite fun, really. So I noticed this, and the thing that I know based on trying it on and having a look at how I want the next version of this jumper to be, I know that I don't want this raglan to be as long so that I don't need to do this weird narrowing shape here. So I'm going to measure the raglan. We'll do this in inches because I did use an inch measurement for the depth of that neckline. And on this one, I can see that the raglan continued to almost just a little over 12 inches actually. And that's way too long. So I'm going to note in here that the raglan was continued to 12 inches, but also that that is far too long. And so looking at this, I am instead going to say, I probably need to go to 10.5 inches, I would say. We'll say 10 inches. And then that's something that I can interpret how I want. When I get there, I can try it on and see how that is fitting at that point. The only other thing that's particularly complicated about this is finding out how the underarm was constructed, whether there were extra stitches cast on for the underarm. And if there are extra stitches cast on for the underarm, when you don't have this big error that this particular jumper has, it's going to look a little more like this. If you are looking for how many stitches were cast on at the underarm, you can simply find this and count them in between those points where the stitches change direction. You can see here that we have a kind of triangular shape almost. That's the point at which it was separated for the sleeves, and that is the other point at which it was separated for sleeves. And you can see those columns continuing in there that show you that sleeves were cast on at the underarm to then be picked up for the sleeve. For this jumper, I don't believe that I will need to cast any on at the underarm. You don't really need to with raglans. However, that's something I'm going to leave because there was such a big error at the underarm on this one. I'm not going to try to read what actually happened there so much as to just try to make something that works better. Now, we're going to count how many stitches we need on the sleeve by the time the raglan finishes. This is very simple because this is cables, because one purl section plus one knit section is 10 stitches. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. And then this is all part that I'm not going to use. So I know that the sleeves that I want are going to be 90 stitches around, but that the original is 110. Sleeve width at divide for underarms, 110 stitches in the original, and I want that to be 90 stitches. Yeah. And let's also do the same for the body. Body width is about 240 stitches. And I'm not that concerned about being any more exact than that, because ultimately this doesn't have any shaping. And again, I can tell because it is plain stockinette stitch at the underarms. So basically what that means, if you don't have any shaping in the body and you don't have any shaping at the sleeves, down this underarm, it means that whatever your final stitch count will be, it will be achieved by the time you get to the end of the raglan. So you don't need to worry particularly about the exact stitch counts there. You just knit to the end of the raglan and begin going down the body, and you should automatically have the right number of stitches. Obviously, that's something that you need to check when you are knitting it up. And then we're going to take one last look at the sleeves to determine a couple of things. So the first thing is that we need to measure the sleeve, and I'm going to measure it from this point at the neck because that is the most exact way to do this. So I'm going to measure it from the neckband all the way down to where the cuff begins, and that is 24 inches. And what I'm actually going to do here is draw a little diagram of this jumper. So we have our cables here, and we have a measurement of 24 inches from the neckline point to the beginning of the cuff. We're going to measure the same thing for the depth of the body. And this is a point at which you should take as many measurements as you think will be useful. This measures 20 inches from top to bottom. So I'm just going to draw that in, 20 inches. So that's from the very top to the very bottom. Do take as many measurements as you can, especially if you're reproducing something that you didn't knit in the first place. You may want to take measurements of the width at the underarm, the chest, the waist at the very bottom. Take measurements of the arm width, the cuff width and depth. Measurements are going to be your friend in reproducing something like this, mainly because if you like the fit of the original jumper, if you're looking to reproduce the fit, you're going to need to get those measurements really accurate. You cannot get the same fit unless you have actually done some measurements. Right, and let's just check the cuffs. The cuffs are done by decreasing every other stitch, I believe. It's either every stitch or every other stitch to bring that in. Let's see if we can figure that out. The easiest place to look on this particular piece is to look at these cables, and you can look right at the bottom of them. We know that they started with 8, and ended with 4. So we know that it was 2 stitches knit together all the way around in order to decrease for this cuff. Now, there is obviously more information that you can glean from a jumper. You can look at how were the cast-ons and bind-offs done, how were stitches handled in various places, what were the increases and decreases like, which specific ones were used. However, I now have enough information from this examination that I can reproduce this jumper. And you may notice that most of the information that I needed had to do with stitch gauge and then the beginning of the jumper. This is something that's true of pretty much any jumper. Once you get it started, it is easier to continue, and that's true as well for when you are kind of harvesting a pattern from a pre-existing jumper. It is always going to be easier once you get that first part finished. And there we have it. I have all of the information that I need in order to reproduce this jumper, and I am definitely going to be doing this again in future. I would be very interested in trying this for some more complicated patterns. Obviously, we haven't covered all of the possibilities in this video, but I hope that this gives you a sense of what you can do if you want to reproduce a jumper that you already own or to create something from scratch. I hope that this video has given you the confidence you need to go ahead and start examining your own knitwear a bit more, to try to understand how the patterns were constructed and to see if you can reconstruct some of your own favorites from just a jumper without a pattern. I know for me, I am going to be remaking this jumper in a beautiful new color, and I'm looking forward to it very much. I hope you have a great week and that you have a nice time with your own knitting. Bye!